Good evening to those in India and across the region, and good morning to those joining from the United States. My name is Patricia Lucina, and I'm the Chargé d'Affaires of the U.S. Diplomatic Mission to India, coming to you live from our Consulate General in Chennai. Welcome to today's discussion, Growing a Green Economy with Renewable Energy, organized jointly by the U.S. Embassy and U.S. consulates across India and in association with the Ananta Center. President Biden is taking bold actions to tackle the climate crisis. In one of his first acts in the White House, President Biden signed an executive order to bring the United States back into the Paris Agreement. In April, he convened 40 heads of government and many other representatives from business and civil society for a virtual leaders summit on climate. At the summit, the United States, India, and other nations announced ambitious new climate targets. World leaders committed to emissions reductions targets that would keep the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. In support of this goal, the United States and India launched the U.S.-India Climate and Clean Energy Agenda 2030 partnership, which lays out a bold vision for our countries to work together over the coming decade to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. This partnership is moving forward with the active involvement of our government's top officials. U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, has already visited India twice in the past year. With Prime Minister Modi, he affirmed U.S.-India collaboration on a 2030 agenda for clean technologies and climate action, and commended India's ambitious agenda for climate action, particularly the target of installing 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by the end of the decade. India deserves recognition for its global leadership in taking action to address the climate crisis. On his most recent visit to India, Special Envoy Kerry praised India for being a world leader in demonstrating that economic development and clean energy can go hand in hand, noting that India has already achieved roughly 100 gigawatts of the 450 gigawatts goal. Prime Minister Modi's initiative to establish the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure further demonstrates India's leadership on climate issues. For our part, the United States has set ambitious domestic goals. The United States aims to achieve a carbon emissions-free power sector by 2035, putting America on a path to becoming a net zero economy by 2050. We should be proud of these aggressive goals and our achievements. In order to overcome the challenges we face, such as unpredictable wildfires, cyclones, flooding, and drought, it is incumbent on all of us to do everything we can. The world is counting on India and the United States to act boldly against the climate crisis. There remains much more we can accomplish together. Today, I am thrilled to invite two of the most influential thought leaders in the United States and India to explore the complex issues surrounding our efforts to address the climate crisis. Thomas Friedman is an internationally renowned author, reporter, and columnist for the New York Times. He is a 3-time recipient of the Pulitzer Prize and author of 7 best-selling books. His writing has shaped the way millions understand the world we live in today, and Mr. Friedman has been at the vanguard of the green economy movement for decades. In fact, he is widely credited for coining the term Green New Deal in a New York Times piece back in 2007. Tom, thank you so much for participating in today's program.
Good to be here.
Jamshid Godrej is a chairman of the board of Godrej and Boyce Manufacturing and the chairman and trustee of the Ananta Center. He also chairs the board of directors of several influential environment-focused organizations. If I listed every capacity in which he has helped protect our planet, we would be left with no time for the discussion, so I'll stop here. Jamshid, thanks to you and the Ananta Center for participating with us and partnering with us for today's event. Before I yield the virtual stage to Jamshid and Tom, I would like to take a minute to speak directly to our viewers. President Biden described the climate crisis best at the Leaders Summit when he stated, "This is a moral imperative, an economic imperative, a moment of peril, but also a moment of extraordinary possibilities. Earlier this week, the United States lost one of its great leaders, former Secretary of State Colin Powell. Among his words of wisdom worth repeating are, "Perpetual optimism is a force multiplier." I hope today's discussion leaves each of you optimistic that through international cooperation, another force multiplier, we can overcome the peril and make the most of the extraordinary possibilities. Thanks. And over to you, Jamshid and Tom.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chargé d'Affaires Lassina, for your very kind introductions. And it's good to see you again. And thanks to you and your team for inviting me to moderate this conversation today. Tom, it's great to connect with you again. Much has happened since we last met. Changes in governments on both sides. Changes in governments on both sides. A global financial crisis, major shifts in geopolitics to count a few. Most recently, of course, we have been battling a once-in-a-generation pandemic, and while at the same time facing a climate emergency. As we hopefully come out of this pandemic, the global priorities are rightly shifting towards urgent climate action. I look forward to a very rich discussion with you today on growing a green economy with renewable energy and setting the foundations of a post-COVID world, which is environmentally sustainable. So Tom, let's just dive straight in. For over a decade, you have been trying to gain the attention of some of the world's leaders to the urgency of addressing the climate crisis. How would you assess global efforts? Can we be optimistic that we will avoid the worst case scenarios that the climate change models are showing us?
Well, Jamshid, first of all, it's great to be with you, one of India's true thought leaders and industrial leaders on this issue. So the honor is really mine. You know, when I think about where we are today and where we were maybe 20 years ago when I first started writing about this.
They've got 470 participants.
Tom, would you mind unmuting? Sorry.
Unmute. Hold on. Am I still there? Okay. Okay. Am I back?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Jamshid, first of all, let me repeat what I said while I was muted, which is that it's a great thrill to be back talking to you, one of India's real thought leaders and industrial leaders on this whole green energy challenge. And we've come a long way in 20 years. The debate is over. The debate is really over. The weather is over. The WHETHER. Now it's all about the how. So let me just take a few minutes to frame for you and this great audience that you and the embassy have gathered, how I think about the how part of this. So, you know, I think about it in terms of sort of 5 or 6 points. The first thing you have to do is name the problem right. I'm a big believer that to name something is to own it. If you can name it, you can really own how people think about the issue. The world is flat, for instance. And the problem with green for so many years is that the people who named it, Jamshid, actually hated it. So they named it sissy, liberal, leftist, girly man, unpatriotic, vaguely French, vaguely French. You know, if you were doing green, you looked a little French. What I've tried to do over the last 20 years is to rename green geopolitical, geostrategic, capitalistic, innovative, entrepreneurial, patriotic. From an American point of view, green is the new red, white, and blue. So I've really tried to own this thing and take the naming of it away from the people who hated it, okay, number one. Second, I think it's really important to frame the issue in a way, and you as someone who's both a green and an industrialist will understand this, that you can bring in the widest audience. So when I wrote my book back in 2008, Hot, Flat, and Crowded, I actually began my book tour in Oklahoma. Actually, it's to an oil and gas group. Because I thought, well, if I can't talk to these people, what good is it? And what I said to them is basically, look, I believe in climate change. You all really don't. Let's set that aside for a second. That's between you and your beach house, okay? Let's agree on what we all can agree on, and that's math. There are about 7 billion people on the planet. When I was talking to them, we're gonna have another billion by the year 2030, another billion people on the planet. And if most of them decide they wanna eat American-sized Big Macs, live in American-sized houses, and drive American-sized cars, we're gonna burn up, heat up, choke up the planet far worse than even Al Gore predicts if we have a billion more people here. What does that mean from an American point of view or from an Indian point of view? What that means is the next great global industry has to be clean energy, clean power, clean water, and energy efficiency. Otherwise, we're going to be a bad biological experiment. That's what it means. So I then said to that audience, please raise your hand. And I would say the same in India. Please raise your hand if you think India or America can be a great economic power in the 21st century and not dominate or be a major player in the next great global industry. Clean energy, clean power, clean water, and energy efficiency. So we can even set whether you believe in climate change aside or not. By the way, if climate change, if you get ready for climate change as India or America, and guess what, it doesn't come. What's the worst thing? The worst thing is you'll have a more efficient, cleaner, less polluting, less wasteful economy. You'll be like an athlete who trained for the World Olympics, and the Olympics didn't come. But boy, are you still fit. That's if climate change doesn't happen. And if it does happen, obviously, we'll be far more prepared for it. That's compared for not preparing for it and risking a real disaster. So once you name it, once you frame it, then you got to talk about the proper scale of it. So I don't have to tell you, Jamshed, clean energy and clean power is a scale problem. It's a scale problem. If you don't have scale, you have a hobby. I like hobbies. I used to build model airplanes as a young boy. I wouldn't try to change the climate as a hobby. So let's name it, let's frame it, let's scale it, and then we have to shape it properly. And here I'm a big believer that there's only one thing bigger than Mother Nature, or one thing as big as Mother Nature, and that's the market, Father Greed. And the way you actually get the scale you need to take on Mother Nature is by fully activating and mobilizing Father Greed, the market. That's the only thing big enough and powerful enough. Well, to do that, then you've got to bend the market. Once we name it, frame it, scale it, shape it, you got to bend the market to do what you want it to do, because the market's just dumb. If you incentivize it for coal or dirty fuels, it'll give you dirty fuels. But if you incentivize it other ways, it'll produce different, greener outcomes. So for me, what does that mean? That means about 80% of global emissions today are actually produced by just the 20 leading economies, one of which, of course, is India and another being America. The 20 leading economies actually produce 80% of the emissions. So I'm focused first on those. Then within those 20 big economies, there are 4 sectors, what my friend Hal Harvey from Energy Innovations called the 4 zeros that we need to aspire to. 0 net energy buildings, 0 carbon emission electricity, 0 waste manufacturing, and 0 emission transportation. So we want to focus on those 4 zeros in the 80% of the in the 20 countries that produce the 80% of the emissions. And for each one, then you need to have framing policies that shape the market to give you the outcomes you want. So for 0 net energy buildings, buildings that produce as much energy as they consume, you want the right building codes. For 0 emission automobiles, all powered by electricity, you want rising fuel efficiency standards. For 0 waste emission electricity generation, you want renewable portfolio standards that ask every electric company to steadily be improving its renewable spectrum of its mix. And lastly, for zero waste manufacturing, you want ever rising equipment standards. The goal is there, the tools are there. All that's missing, Jamshid, now is the will to do it.
Yes, Tom, I think that's very, very, very well framed. And, you know, both our countries, of course, are democracies. I think both of us love the fact that we have so many people saying so many different things at the same time that sometimes it's difficult to sort of change, you know, and understand what the real narrative is. But clearly, you know, both India and the US, despite being such great democracies, you know, they come to this issue from different points of view. And the US has been an industrial powerhouse. India has not. But India, you know, is the third largest emitter today of greenhouse gases, CO2 and others. And we have a big agricultural sector like the US has, etc. So I think the question that always keeps coming up, you know, whenever we have a debate on climate, is that what is the responsibility of India? What is the responsibility of the US? You know, how is India going to transition to a green economy? You know, and is it in India's interest to transition to a green economy when we have so many problems? Forget about COVID for a moment, but we have problems on healthcare, we have problems on education, we have to do enormous amounts of development work, etc. So this debate keeps coming up and again. My answer normally is that yes, we may not be responsible for where we are, but we are very much responsible for where we are going.
That's
Your
well
thoughts?
said. Yeah, that's really well said. I would say a couple things, what our different responsibilities are. I've thought about this a lot. So our responsibility as a wealthy country that has been emitting long before at larger scale than India has, you know, and it takes as primary responsibility, not sole, but primary responsibility for a lot of the carbon in the atmosphere. It seems to me it's our job to innovate the clean technologies and then use our government power and market to drive them down the cost volume curve. So whether it's energy efficiency systems, wind power, solar power, hydropower, in my view, nuclear power, is to innovate those, deploy them when they're really expensive, too expensive for a country like India maybe to adopt right away, and then use our market forces to drive them down the cost volume curve where a country like India can then use them to scale. That's our obligation, it seems to me. India's obligation is to, I think, understand there is something, first of all, cruel about this. Most of the emissions started with us, and there's something deeply unfair for us to then come to India and say, well, now you guys got to immediately get off coal, you know. So as I said, the first thing we have to do is drive the price of the alternatives down. But at the same time, I will tell you what I say to Chinese when they make the same argument to me. I've said this to Chinese audience. I say, you're right, you're right. We caused most of the emissions. You didn't do much. Just take your time, because we're going to invent all the new clean power, clean energy, clean water, and energy efficiency systems. And then we're going to come over here and sell them to you, and we're going to crush you in the next great global industry. So please take your time, take your time. We don't want to bother you. It's all our fault, you know? And so I like to appeal to people's self-interest, because there's enormous innovative power in India, in the solar and wind sector. I don't have to tell you, and even in the nuclear power center. And when a country like India can take some of these new tools and drive them down to the cost level where they are affordable in India, oh my God, you have a globally scalable industry. So to me, it's to appeal to the win-win incentive of our two countries.
Yep. You know, you brought China into our discussion, and rightly so, because, you know, in many things like solar panels, for instance, you know, China has made solar panels at scale, and they have been responsible, you know, for driving costs down right now.
Okay.
I mean, I'm sure that there will be some new innovation, new technology that will come our way, and somebody in the US may do that. And The interesting thing is that when we talk of China, we do have to talk of scale, because we understand, of course, that they have become the manufacturer of the world. And as your very, very recent few days ago opinion piece in the New York Times said, you hold one big key, which is semiconductors.
Absolutely.
And
That's all we've got
yeah.
left.
So I'm trying to say that, okay, India, we already have solar energy, which we produce using,
Yes.
the best panels that we can get, etc. And the cost is very, very economical today. The only problem, of course, as we all know, is that, solar energy will be available when the sun shines,
Yes.
and batteries are still a long way away from
Yes.
being really economical. So here we have three countries, India, China, USA, all wanting to work in this direction. How do you think we should try to work together?
It's a very good question. I wish that I thought we could all sort of put our brain power together and do that. But unfortunately, politics and culture will prevent that, But at the same time, there is such an incentive for America, for India, and for China to be that breakthrough player, particularly in storage, in batteries, which would change so much of this story. We're getting closer. We're getting closer all the time, but we're not there yet. One advantage that India has, as it had in telephony, was in so many cases, it was able to go from no phones to cell phones and skip basically landlines. And I think the same is true in clean energy, that places, that had virtually no electricity or very little can skip, dependence on the grid and go to distributed energy, where solar panels on every roof. Now the battery issue is still a problem for when the sun doesn't shine, or when the wind doesn't blow. But moving in that direction, I think for India, installing that base of solar power, because the batteries will come. They are getting better all the time. They're not here yet, but they're getting better all the time. India has the potential to be such a leader in this area, because just as it has found ways to drive, for instance, drug prices down, certain elements of telemedicine down, to levels where the insurance, where the poorest Indian could afford them, $1 a week, or $5 a month, whatever. It has an incredible ability to drive down the cost of green alternatives as well. And remember, of course, this is a healthcare issue. How many Indians have died or suffered breathing ailments from breathing bad air from waste-driven fuels or coal and diesel? And so it's a win-win for India. And while it's right, it's a little unfair because those emissions were put up for us, there's a chance for India to leapfrog both, kind of history and become a real leader in a field where the leader has not been established yet.
Yeah. It reminds me also of the fact that, for instance, India and Indians, almost 60% of Indians are so dependent on agriculture. And we have not been able to move to industrial agriculture the way the US has, and
Yes.
where barely 1% of the population today works in agriculture, actually, because of high scale
Yes.
of mechanization, etc. And so we have a real problem, of employment, of being able to provide jobs.
Yes.
We have a significant, methane problem, and that's associated with agriculture, and a significant water problem that's associated again with agriculture. And these are big problems that need big solutions. And my question to you is that, how do you think India should approach these issues?
So let me respond to that by telling you a slightly controversial story. But what the heck? on January 3rd, 2020, the Trump administration, the previous administration, actually assassinated the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard with a drone. His name was Qasem Soleimani. I was in New Zealand when that happened. And my editors called me and said, Tom, you need to write a column about this. I said, guys, I'm in New Zealand, okay? I'm on vacation. Please leave me alone. But I went to bed that night and I got up the next morning and a column struck me. I opened up my laptop and I wrote it in 45 minutes, basically. And this was the lead I wrote. And this is not to approve this or I'm not getting into the controversy around it, but this was the lead I wrote. America just killed the dumbest man in Iran. Wow, I looked at that and said, where did that come from? What was I saying? And what I was saying was, I'm not going to judge you in the old ways as a leader, when the issue was your resistance and our, intervention, and that was the conflict and intervention and resistance. I'm actually going to judge you as a leader by how you are addressing the problems of your people in the context within which they're living, okay? And the context within which Iranians are living today is that their biggest lake, Urmia, has basically dried up. They're suffering massive drought in the southern part of the country, so much so that people took to the streets to protest and need water trucks. By the way, the Taliban are facing this in Afghanistan. They're in the middle of the worst drought in 35 years. And for so many years, they identified themselves, and we treated them around the issue of resistance. We're going to judge you on resistance, okay? And they wanted to be judged themselves on, I am leading the resistance. And what I'm saying, Jamshid, is we need to judge leaders, India's leader, President Trump, America's leader, not on resistance, but in resilience. What resilience are you building for your people in the context within which they're living? Indians today are living in a context which you just identified, where its climate is changing, its water resources are changing, and its number one security goal is going to be, and this is how every prime minister has to be judged, not on whether you're building resistance to one group or ethnicity or another. Are you building resilience for your people? And that's what I say to my president. That's what I say to Iran's leaders. I am not going to judge you anymore by that old yardstick, whether you are resisting us and we're resisting you. I'm going to judge you on whether you're building resilience for your people in the context within which they're living, which is now a context of climate change, diminishing water, extreme weather, and often extreme droughts. That's how we need to shift. And leaders who want to play the old game, whether it's American leaders, or Iranian leaders, or Indian leaders, or Pakistani leaders, they're now in my, I'm looking at them and I'm saying, I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to reward you for all that old stuff, that old BS in my view. I'm only going to reward you on resilience.
No, that is so true. I mean, both our countries talk of infrastructure, and we have to talk of infrastructure at a time when climate is changing in such a strong and drastic way. We've seen the type of damage it's done through hurricanes, through droughts, fires in the US. We are facing no less. I mean, the city I'm in right now, Mumbai, the prediction says that in 50 years, we might be underwater.
Yes.
Well, and what are we doing about that? So these are the really big gorillas in the room for us.
That's
and
right.
Whilst we're talking, of a global meeting to discuss climate change and net zero goals, etc., I somehow feel that the urgency that is there for our people don't seem to be the same in terms of the urgency in our governments. So what should we do about that?
Yeah, it's a problem because as in India, so as in America, as the Chargé so well put it, I mean, President Biden, I give him a lot of credit. He has come in and he's made this a centerpiece of his agenda, but we're a democracy and India is a democracy. So he's got to fight with the Congress and with the opposition party here, which is really still embedded in support from the fossil fuel industry in many ways. Although a lot of Republicans have come around, business Republicans, that shift has happened within the business community. You know, we had a very interesting thing happened here, and a close friend of mine was involved in it, which I point out to you. So ExxonMobil is was the biggest company in America. It's not anymore, but it was the biggest oil company. And they recently had a shareholder vote on for the new board. And 3 dissidents, all of them green power advocates, were elected to the Exxon board. And the reason they got elected, were able to get elected, was because 3 of the biggest shareholders, Fidelity, Vanguard, and BlackRock, all supported them. So you see where the business community is at right now, and they understand this. The problem is that because we're both democracies, neither leader can snap his fingers, and the opposition is still very strong and very powerful. We see that with the debate over Senator Manchin, who represents a coal state in America, and what he wants to get into this the latest Biden package. So it's a real challenge. There's no question. That's why I began by saying I try to frame the issue, Jamshid, less about climate change and more about economic growth, economic power, and future of jobs. If you start there, you can get a much wider audience behind you.
Yes. No, I entirely agree with you. In fact, even on the debate on climate finance, if you recall in the Paris Agreement, there was a commitment that $100 billion a year would be funded for climate resilience and adaptation, etc. And we know that that's a tough one. So finally, it's the private sector that's going to have to step in.
Exactly.
If we can't get the private sector to come behind investments for climate related issues, to expect that governments around the world are going to fund this is just not feasible. So how best do you think we should promote ourselves in order to get global financial flows, which are mostly private sector flows, into more and more into climate? I mean, what do you think these funds would actually want to see happen?
Well, it really is happening now in America. If you look at the new emergence of SPACs, for instance, this new market vehicle for starting public companies, so many of them revolve around greens, and every company has its own now, ESG standards, and the debate is really over. The question is to get the speed going at the scale that we need. That's really the challenge. But business pretty much is there. And even the traditional oil companies understand they've got to become energy companies. Now, at the same time, we need, Jamshid, and you will understand this as well as anybody, we need the green movement to also be realistic. What I'm terrified by this winter, because the most dangerous thing you can do, speaking as a man, is take off your belt before you have your suspenders on. Because when that happens, your pants often fall down, okay? Well, the energy equivalent of that is to say, abandon nuclear power, get rid of, other forms of clean energy before you actually have enough wind, solar to power your economy. That's kind of what Germany has done. Now, I happen to be a believer in nuclear power. I don't see how you get 24-hour baseload clean energy without a nuclear power being part of the mix. Now, I realize it's got safety issues and it's got regulatory issues. It's very challenging. But what I am terrified of is that this winter in Europe, because people like Germany got rid of a lot of their nuclear power, phased it out, as has the UK to some degree, and the renewables, because they had a summer with low wind, and sometimes the sun doesn't shine, the renewables are not there, and they aren't in a position to import natural gas except from Russia, okay, which puts Putin in a very strong position. What are they doing? They're burning coal again. They're burning more coal. So we have to understand, we are not in the energy revolution. We are in the energy transition. I wish we were in the energy revolution. We are in a transition. And that transitions means get off coal and get on as much as you can natural gas, which emits, as long as you control the methane, and which we don't do well enough, but if you do, emits about half as much CO2 as coal. That is the obvious transition fuel till we can get wind, solar, hydro, and don't get rid of your nuclear until you really have a scale replacement for it. So the danger is, you know, I wrote in my book, A Hot, Flat, and Crowded, that I wrote in 2008, Jamshed, my favorite chapter was called, If It Isn't Boring, It Isn't Green. If it isn't boring, it isn't green. And the theme of the chapter was, everyone wants to be Al Gore. I want to be Al Gore. I love Al. I want to win an Oscar, an Emmy, you know, I mean, I want to go, you know, go out on the street and have people flock around me. I want to be Al Gore. But the real heroes, Al is a real hero, but the other real heroes of the energy movement are people like this guy at the Natural Resources Defense Council who figured out, how do you cut in half the energy emission of an American Coke machine, Coke dispensing machine? They figured out how to cut that in half. Now, to do that, you actually first have to understand the physics and engineering of a Coke machine. And then you have to understand how it interfaces with a public electricity utility. Now, there, Jamshed, is nothing on God's green earth more boring than a public electricity facility. There's nothing more boring than that. To study an electricity utility, it doesn't get any more boring. But to master this, to really be green, you got to master the engineering of this stuff. It isn't just about tweeting. I tweeted about that. That's like firing a mortar into the Milky Way galaxy. Okay, you have to get out of Facebook and into people's face. You have to get out of Facebook and inside a Coke machine or a public electricity utility. That's how you change the world. And if it isn't boring, it isn't green. It means that you're not really dealing with the core stuff. And so I have a great affection for people who do that.
You know, that reminds me, Tom, that just a little while ago, there was something called a Global Challenge on Cooling. And the challenge was to reduce electricity for an air conditioner by 80%.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, and there were 4 finalists. My company was one of them.
Interesting.
And the Rocky Mountain Institute sort of decided how this was going to be run.
That's
and
great.
Another friend of yours, Tom Steyer, who's a philanthropist, as you know, yes, he funded it.
Interesting.
And it's amazing. It's amazing that when you do some challenge like that,
Yes,
what you can achieve. So that really speaks to your point about innovation and technology. And yes, it may be boring, but you could save the world through that.
exactly. You know, it's a very good point to go back to your other question about America, India, government. These kind of global races to the top, people really rise to these. I mean, and it's amazing where innovation will come from. Actually, in my last book, I wrote about one of these I wrote about General Electric did one of these races to the top around engine fastener for one of its planes. And I forgot what the exact goal was, but I think it was to take 80% of the weight out of this engine fastener. And I think the winner was like some 18-year-old kid in Indonesia who didn't even know anything about aerospace. So all of us are smarter than one of us. It's amazing where innovation can come from. And it's amazing how much people like to do this for free and to open source this problem or create just, you know, the smallest incentives. It's amazing what people will do. And that's what we've got to leverage. But it's about the physics. You have to know stuff, you know, in order to really make a difference.
So that's a great segue for us to go into audience questions. And I have one here. It's from Arjun Gargas of the Takshila Institution. And he asks, some analysts have attributed the recent spike in global energy prices and the looming energy crisis to a concept called greenflation. The rise in energy prices has been equated to the restrictions placed on certain governments on traditional energy sources like coal and natural gas. Can continued support to renewable sources of energy and regulations on coal, natural gas by governments lead to future inflation of energy markets and potential storage of supply of these traditional energy sources to developing countries, which are still highly dependent on these energy sources to provide basic amenities to their citizens?
It's a very good point. It's a very good question. What basically happened was, first we had a pandemic and energy prices collapsed because demand collapsed. But when energy prices collapse, that means investment in new natural gas in America in particular, wells get closed, banks foreclose on companies, okay? But then demand actually snapped back, despite the pandemic, far faster than most people anticipated. So you had demand surge, but meanwhile we had, in the natural gas area, had really curbed a lot of investment and therefore production. And so in that gap, what happened? People in China, in Europe, turned to coal. It was the obvious and only thing they can do. And my fear is this winter, if that gap persists and people actually are put in the position, Jamshid, of heat or eat. Heat or eat. If people in India, if people in Europe say heat or eat, we're in a really bad place, because they will then say, just whatever you need, get that electricity out there. And that's why we have to remember, we are in a transition, not a revolution. I wish it were a revolution, but this is so big. You cannot just flip this thing. You can only do that when you're at a college seminar, okay? You can't in real life just turn a switch and flip the whole global energy system. So you have to be really smart about how we keep this transition, because my fear is, if we have a really bad winter, particularly in Europe, the whole green movement could be delegitimized. Oh, you people with your climate, all your climate talk. Well, nobody heating my home. And I had to decide between heat or eat. And a populist politician in America or India could really take advantage of that.
Yeah, that's so true. So another question, Mr. Branadi Arol, who is the president of the Hyderabad Software Enterprise Association. His question is, for a true green economy and growth of renewable energy resources, we need a green channel for technology flow across the world. In other words, how can we facilitate tech transfer that allows transfer of green technologies and resources that help in the implementation of green projects around the world without bottlenecks created by tariff regimes and political compulsions?
A very good question. And I don't know exactly how you would do this, but there has to be some tariff-free arrangement on the sale, export, and import of any kind of green technology. Exactly as the questioner asked, Jamshid, so we can quickly scale the diffusion of these as we in America pay up front to drive them down the cost volume curve.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question from Smita Nair. Why don't countries start issuing tickets to industries and other stakeholders for destroying the climate? Added context for reference. Climate jurisprudence as a narrative has been gaining momentum recently. The UN Human Rights Council recently declared having a clean, healthy environment a human right, which begs the question, what happens to those who violate this right? What happens when governments violate it? What happens when industries or even citizens do? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, one thing about this world, I don't think we have to do it formally, because I don't have to tell you, Jamshid, when you're hiring 21-year-olds, college grads to work for you at Ananta and your industries, the first thing they're going to do after you get done interviewing them is interview you. Is this a green company? Is it sustainable? If it isn't, I don't want to work here. There's no way you can attract talent now from this new generation unless you're on the right side of this story. So I think that issue is taken care of itself. And again, one of the upsides of social networks, there are many downsides, but one of the upsides is any person with their cell phone now can take a picture of your toxic waste leak and post it on Twitter or Facebook, and you immediately have a giant brand problem. And so every company is aware of that today. And every company is trying to get ahead of it. We need to do more of that. I'm speaking about in America, but I think in India too. Boy, if a company, pollutes a river or whatever, and people put that up on social network, it's got a real problem. And we need to be doing that more and more. It's why I tell people, one of the reasons I tell people, John, I'm not a nice green, I'm a mean green. Yeah, I mean, and I believe being as mean and tough-minded as any oil and coal company, because they're tough, and we have to be as tough-minded about these issues, but also understanding we're in a transition. We're in a transition, not a revolution. The revolution will come when we get through the transition.
Yeah. No, you're correctly pointing to the power of the social media and being able to name and shame. And
Yes.
that doesn't always happen by authorities. It's more effective when it happens by citizens groups.
Absolutely.
So there's a question from Dr. Mangesh Kashyap. In your opening comments, one of the 4 green priorities you highlighted was net zero waste generation. How do you think India or even the US should manage waste generated by renewable energy? While renewable energy wasters may be less toxic than the other variety, it is still hazardous and needs to be dealt with. Do you see enough of thought policies on this in India and the US?
Another very good question. I can't speak to India, but what you see in America is just steadily rising equipment standards. So whether it's for a boiler or a refrigerator or a combustion engine, the strategy is to every year say, here's the rising standard this year, next year, third year, and then to call out in a positive way the real trendsetters, the real market leaders. Give them a gold star, reward them with affirmation and praise, and that they can then leverage, in the marketplace. But it's that idea of steadily rising standards. I really go back to my general framework. The only thing that can take on Mother Nature is Father Greed. It's the market. And the market's just stupid. If you incentivize it, as we've been doing, to have exploit cheap and dirty coal or crude oil, it's going to give you a dirty economy. If you incentivize it in a different way, we know this around health issues, safety issues, seat belts, just to name one, or catalytic converters in cars. If you incentivize the market to behave differently, it will behave differently. Now, the first thing it will do is start kicking and screaming, oh my God, if you ask me to improve that catalytic converter, as Lee Iacocca once said, it's the end of the auto industry. I mean, something equivalent to that. We'll all go out of business. This is the traditional industry reaction. Oh my God, you're going to bankrupt us. China will take over the world. And then what do? They go out and figure it out how to do it faster, cheaper, sooner. Okay, so you got to not be intimidated by these guys. You set a high standard, and whammo, the market will do it. And that gives you the leverage you need, because without that, you won't have scale.
Yeah. Yep. So here's a question from Dr. Gomathina Yangam. What are your thoughts on a realistic timeline for hydrogen to become a scaled up energy carrier? And in that vein, Prime Minister Modi recently announced a national hydrogen mission with the aim to make India a hub of green hydrogen production and for us to be energy independent before the century mark of independence. Which is 2047. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was just out in Silicon Valley talking to people, and there are a lot. I'm thrilled to hear that Prime Minister Modi wants to push India and India's intellectual and scientific talent in this direction, because there are a lot of people trying to figure out how to take the H away from the 2O, okay, and give us a stream of hydrogen energy. The basic processes are there. It's doing it at a cost level and at a water level that is affordable. But I've been talking to a lot of people about this. It's one of the most exciting areas. Another exciting area is fusion, and what people are doing around fusion, and the possibility that we'll get a breakthrough there in the next 5 years. You know, if you look at the trajectory of science these days and the introduction of artificial intelligence, I really think that with the next 5 years, fusion and hydrogen, which always seemed like the energy fuels of the future and would always be, you know, that future may actually be our present. I'm very excited about what's going on.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot there. In fact, earlier you spoke about sometimes intellectual property being put in the public domain to benefit everybody. And, you know, I was associated with Toyota for a long time when they decided they wanted to put
hydrogen cars,
a lot of their information and knowledge on fuel cells, you know, for hydrogen in the public domain. And I mean, these are obviously, you know, things of the future, and how best we all can take advantage of that is always a great. So, you know, apparently we have been getting lots of questions around green jobs. Essentially what people are saying is that, you know, they are raising the connection between livelihoods and climate change, loss of livelihoods, forced migration at the hands of extreme weather events, you know, which in reality are already happening regularly. And there's a, you know, positive connection here between job creation, job growth, and investment in green energy and sustainable infrastructure. And how do you think the world is going to react to the need for more and more of these type of jobs, which are, you know, so-called green jobs?
Yeah, I mean, you know, all the studies showed that the number of jobs in the green tech sector, green energy sector in America today are growing far faster than anything around coal, oil, or gas, number one, and they tend to pay more. You know, not at every level, but at a lot of levels. So there is really something there. It's not just, you know, just hype. I think. I mean, if you want to have solar panels on your roof, you know, there's no robot that can do that right now. Somebody's got to get up there, install it properly, connect it to your home, connect the home to the grid. These are all jobs, let alone manufacture that device. So, you know, I think that's, you know, clearly going to be a shift that the economy is going to undergo. I think, though, that we also should keep one more thing in mind, Jamshid, because we tend to talk about energy, climate, clean energy, and not about biodiversity. And that nature provides us so many energy services, trees that store carbon, oceans that sequester carbon, trees that filter water. And that part of any green strategy has to be a preservation of tropical forests, of oceans, of streams, of mangroves that cushion us from severe extreme weather from the ocean, hurricanes and the like. So always remember that there has got to be an ethic of conservation around all of this. We're not just going to solve the problem by green economy, that there also has to be a behavioral change about how we think about energy, but also how we think about the environment. Because Mother Nature doesn't need us. We need Mother Nature. And she is one of the greatest preservers and storers of carbon that, you know, that's on the planet. In fact, she's the greatest.
Yeah. No, that reminds me that what you see behind me actually is a painting of our manufacturing campus, which is surrounded by mangroves.
That's great.
My family for the last 50 years has, you know, spent a lot of time, energy, and effort to look after those mangroves.
That's in Mumbai. Is that in Mumbai, Jen? Is that in Mumbai? Interesting.
That's right. It's Mumbai.
I want to see that
on the
next
eastern
time.
side. Yeah.
I want to see that next time I'm there.
Please. Yeah, please do that.
Yeah.
So I think, Tom, we're going to pretty soon come to the end of our time and together here on this call. And I think the big question on everyone's mind right now is that COP26 in Glasgow is 2 weeks away. And I think if one reads some of the editorials and comment articles that are coming out these days, you know, there was a lot of hope, but that hope seems to be somewhat subdued under the present circumstances. And what do you think, I mean, not only your expectations, but what should happen in a COP? And of course, this COP is like all COPs, you know, it's one in the series of COPs. It's not going to be the last one. And we have to keep on working on, getting everyone together so that the world can come to net zero by 2050.
Well, you know, Jamshid, I think I've been to every COP since Bali, and I wish them well. It's a great time just to energize everybody, to get people to make commitments. But at the end of the day, what really matters is what people like yourself do in your own environment. You know, are you living in a context in India where it is profitable, important, inspiring to continue to innovate and scale green energy? And if that's happening in India, then good things will happen. The COP can't make that happen. I think of it a lot like the UN. People complain about the UN. What is the UN? It's just a group of countries who come together. You know, it doesn't exist independent of those countries, and neither does the COP. And so what really matters is what people like you do on the ground in your country. If the COP inspires more people to do that, affirms them in a way that they want to do more of it, that's great. But it's not what changes the world. The world of energy does not change, you know, by COPs. It changes by 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 in India, in America, in China, and everywhere else.
Thank you so much for this wonderful interaction that we've had in the evening for me, morning for you. And
well, Jamshid, it's great. It's
but,
great. It's great to be with you again. Next time in person.
Yeah.
Thanks to the embassy for organizing this.
Right. And thank you very much to you for participating. And I have to thank the US Embassy and all the consulates in India, the Ananta Center, and everyone who've been on the call for this last 1 hour. And I really appreciate your time with us. Thank you so much, Tom, and goodbye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Hope that was okay, everybody.